Excellent. Grateful for this chance to have you on our program. Uh, my listeners, the listeners to this podcast in particular, they've been through what they would call a faith journey. At some point, they've had a faith crisis. They've deconstructed their faith and then had to put something back together. And as they've looked out at the landscape, looking for voices to give them kind of some structure, some meaning, some things to kind of hope in as they begin to put things back together. You, my friend, are one of those voices. For maybe the one or two listeners who are not aware of who you are, would you mind maybe just giving kind of a brief introduction of yourself, and then we'll jump into some questions.
I'd be glad to. My career was that of a bishop in the Episcopal Church. I was bishop of the Diocese of Newark, which is northern New Jersey. I was an author, and I put this all in past tense because I retired, and I mean really retired. And I've written a number of books that were designed to lead people past the emotional crisis of being without faith. They were books like Why Christianity Must Change or Die, Biblical Literalism, A Gentile Heresy, my autobiography, which told the story of how a boy from a southern, almost fundamentalist background had become a leader in the battle for gay rights and women in the ministry and other things like that. It's a very exciting life. I've given, I don't know how many, about 150 lectures a year in my retirement. And I've spoken at about 500 universities. I taught at Harvard for a semester. And it's just been a wonderful, exciting career. And I had a stroke in 2016 that put me, not out, but put me down considerably. I lost my right side, didn't function. I've gained that back. I'm not as steady as I used to be, but I'm perfectly comfortable living and working without aid right now. So that's where I am, and it's a wonderful life.
Yeah, I'm glad to hear about your experience. I think the listeners are going to be thrilled to have a chance to kind of just hear your voice and to hear you talk about some of these things. I'm sad to hear some of these challenges you've had recently, but such, I guess, is the case of life.
That's right. Life's not supposed to be a bowl of cherries.
Right. No, it's not. So I want to frame the first question this way. Again, the majority of this audience, they've had the fracture. They've realized that the religious stories they've been told, those don't hold up to the standard of being taken as literal. When this fracture happens, a lot of people just throw in the towel on not only Christianity, but on religion in general. But yet some people seem to manage putting it back together in a new way, and they essentially rewrite their story, and it's certainly what you've done. I'm curious maybe what you think is the key to that. Like, what separates the person who says, look, these stories aren't literal, but there's still deep meaning here, and I still find the Christ of Scripture worth emulating and worshiping, even if that story is not literal, when so many are doing something that involves just throwing in the towel completely?
Yeah. Well, Christianity has an interesting history. It's been a mighty force for good, and it's been a mighty force for evil, and both have been very true. I was a Christian in the South in my early years, and we defended segregation, we defended misogyny, we defended homophobia, all in the name of Christ. This was part of what we did. But the reality is that the changes have been forced upon us over a long period of time, not a short period of time. The first change started in the 16th century. The first one that I would begin to discuss started in the 16th century when Copernicus, who was a Polish monk, studied the stars and came to the conclusion that the Earth did not rotate around or the sun did not rotate around the Earth, and the Earth was not the center of the universe. That was an enormous challenge because everything about the Bible assumed that the Earth was the center of a three-tier universe. We looked up and there was heaven. We looked down and there was hell beneath us. And the whole story was told in terms of that image. How can you read that story literally when the three-tier universe is obliterated? God always came down on top of a mountain because that was halfway between heaven and earth. Jesus ascended into the sky at the end of his life, and that was to go up to heaven where the God was living. And we now are convinced that there's no God up there. I mean, we've traveled in space. There's no God there. We can't pretend that. So if either there is no God and we're all wrong, or the way we understand that God has been dramatically shifting, and we've got to come to grips with a new idea. That was just Copernicus. Several hundred years later, there was Charles Darwin. The Christian story assumed that every human being was created good in the image of God and fell into something called original sin and collapsed. But there's no thing in Darwin about that. There's no sense that we were ever created perfect in the world of nature. And original sin looks like a strange idea. But how do you tell the story of original sin without destroying the Christian faith? Because the Christian faith says it's because we are fallen sinners that Jesus died for us, and that doesn't make any sense when you're a post-Darwinian. You could go on. I'm not going to go on, but you could go on and look at the thought of Sigmund Freud, of Albert Einstein, of Isaac Newton. These are the people that have changed the way we think. And the Christian church needs to keep up with these people and think in terms of their thought. Otherwise, we're completely irrelevant. And the battle for the Christian faith today is a battle to find relevance in the midst of a world of symbols that no longer makes sense to anybody.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I've heard you say before, when you mentioned Jesus' ascension into the heavens, I've heard you mention that if he ascended, if he would still be in this galaxy, if we understand like him ascending and the rate of which that would occur and the where he would be, that only works in a three-tier universe. And so I had a chuckle with that when you've said that before. As you point out, we've always made adaptations. Now, obviously, Christianity as a religion has always been slow to react generally. Certainly, certain denominations perhaps have moved a little faster, but generally we're always stubborn and not wanting to budge even when the data is pointing us in that direction. But as you're pointing out, eventually we always adapt. And so this is just one more time around that we're going to have to adapt to these stories being less literal than we thought.
Well, they're not literal at all. They're not even true. We look back at our history, and the creeds, which are pretty important to the Christian faith, the creeds didn't develop until the fourth century. They're fourth century reality. They're not a Jewish reality, and Jesus was a Jewish person trying to make sense out of his reality. And how does somebody say the creeds? The creeds assume a three-tier universe. The creeds assume a God above the sky. And why do we feel bound to the fourth century? What was holy about the fourth century? It was a time when Christianity was being translated into the Greek categories of the Mediterranean world and not the original categories of Christianity. So we got to, in some sense, the creeds have got to be deliteralized to ever be taken seriously again.
Right. 20 years ago, you wrote a book, Why Christianity Must Change or Die. You mentioned that in your opening introduction. My question is, has Christianity changed? Where are we at in that process? And is Christianity responding in ways that you see as helping it to perpetuate itself?
Well, those are good questions. Let me unpack them a little bit. The fact is that Christianity is changing. My career began, I was ordained in 1955, so I served for the end of the 20th century. And there's great change that took place in that period of time. I grew up a segregationist. Race was a very big reality. I didn't know I was a segregationist. Segregation builds a very big wall around people, and they don't know it. I didn't know, for example, that I went to segregated schools. I just assumed that's the way all schools were. And it wasn't until I began to be aware of the fact that the world is not the way I see it, segregation didn't bother me at all. Then I grew up in a family where a man was not allowed to do anything in the kitchen because that was the place where women worked. We had no women in the church as leaders. That's changed dramatically. We've had a presiding bishop of our church who is a woman, a very outstanding woman, too. And I guess that today our bishops are as many women as men. I'm being succeeded this next month in Newark by a black woman who's been elected the bishop of the Diocese of Newark, where I serve. And she's the third bishop to serve since I retired, but that's just where the change is taking place. I also we have been participant in the movement for gay and lesbian people. And when I retired, I had 35 out of the closet gay and lesbian people in the diocese serving as priests. We don't count them anymore because I don't know how many there are, because we don't treat them as if they're a separate category anymore. But we've got a goodly number of them. We've got a gay bishop. Gene Robinson was elected by the Diocese of New Hampshire, and he was confirmed by the vote of the bishops. That's an enormous change. Now, how do you have all that change when you've got the Bible that you quote and against all of those things, and the Bible clearly condemns them all? When I grew up, the Bible was quoted to promote segregation. I can tell you the text. I won't bother to do that, but I can tell you the text. Then the Bible was quoted to keep women in second-class positions, and the texts are plentiful in Paul and pseudo-Paul. And then the Bible was quoted to condemn homosexuals. I've had Leviticus quoted to me so many times it's sort of etched in stone. And the Bible was simply wrong on those issues. Now, how do you say the Bible is wrong when you've been taught that the Bible is the Word of God? That's where the crisis comes, and you've got to stand and make a decision. I treat the Bible seriously. I don't treat it literally. I love the Bible, but I recognize it's a human book, and it's been warped in its understanding, and the things are just out of hand. You don't defend the Bible today without being irrelevant, and that's a difficult thing for a lot of people to embrace. We've been taught for so long that the Bible is the Word of God that we assume that if you say the Bible is not the Word of God, you cease to be a Christian. Well, the Bible came into being, the New Testament came into being between 51 and 100, and in that period about 50 years. What makes us think those people knew everything about the world that we live in? We've had enormous growth in our knowledge of the world since then, and we've got to keep up with it.
Yeah, and I'm a deep believer in the things that you've spoken of. I've got a couple of your books myself, and having deconstructed the historical Jesus and my religious paradigm, and having reconstructed those in ways they still have deep meaning to me, I'm a huge advocate of the things that you're pushing for. Here's the issue, though. For those who are critical of your work, they will point out that essentially, yes, you're advocating that we become more inclusive, that we become less literal, that we see the meaning in these stories below the literal level. They see that as not working. They look at liberal churches in the world and they see they're in decline, at least for the most part. I know of a few that are actually doing quite well. But for the most part, liberal churches tend to not be strong and vibrant in terms of a growing membership. And so for the critics who are pointing out that this doesn't work, what are your thoughts kind of on that process in terms of still holding
Well, I think they're right. It doesn't work. What works is hysterical religion. If I can convince you that I have the truth and nothing but the truth, then you aren't going to have any problems. But that's not the world we live in. I see no reason to think that Christianity ought to be successful. I think remember Jesus died. He wasn't very successful. And he had the story about Jesus had to be built over generations, and I'm not sure we ever built it correctly. But that's another issue. But it's tough to be a Christian. It's really tough, and I don't believe that we're going to have great masses of people coming. They might come if you say this is the true faith, and if all you have to do is believe it, trust and obey, then that makes people feel secure. If you say you've got to come and wrestle with the truth, people aren't going to want to be secure. They don't want to be bothered with that. But I don't think that makes it valid or invalid. I think Christianity is getting smaller and smaller. I think it will continue to get smaller and smaller. But as it gets smaller and smaller, it will be more and more purified because it's going to be facing the realities that it's got to live with. And there will come a time, I believe, when we will stop this decline and start to grow. There's no question about the fact that liberal churches who don't know who they are, they can't be fundamentalists, and they don't know what to be anymore. So they are declining, and the fundamentalist churches, well, they're beginning to decline too. I mean, that's not quite the success story it once was, but at least they are saying we have the truth, and you can count on us, and that's a very powerful message. It's not true, but it's very powerful.
Yeah, I come from a religious paradigm where my religious framework, the church I belonged to, was a very fundamentalist, high demand religion, and that faith has split into other sects of that church. So there are there's over like a dozen different breakoffs. Some of them have chosen to be more liberal, more inclusive. Some have chosen to be more rigid, more dogmatic. And I think these churches are all making decisions because you're right. I think Christianity in general is in decline. And so it's a matter of whether you want to lose people fast or lose people slow. And I think the conservative churches feel like, oh my goodness, at least we can slow things down. And these other guys are losing people even faster. But as you point out, if we look 100, 400, 1,000 years into the future, the only way Christianity seems to be able to survive is if it responds to where the data of the world leads.
That's correct. We don't have 1,000 years. We probably don't have much more than the rest of this century. The present generation is simply not tuned into Christianity. The millennials just don't. In fact, when they give their religious preference, none is an equal choice between evangelical and Roman Catholic. Those are the three big choices of the millennials, and none is growing faster than the rest of them. I don't think we've got that much time. I just recently wrote my last book, which was titled Unbelievable, Why Neither an Ancient Creed nor the Reformation Can Give Us a Living Faith Today. And it's a book that sort of puts my whole faith into perspective. And I say these things about the church are unbelievable today, and we've got to admit that. That's not going to help people to build big churches. But that's where the world is, and that's where the dialogue can take place. And I think it will take place, and I'm very comfortable in that. I'm sure that there'll be some in the church, some people who will say, I've sold out every tenet of the Christian faith in this book. But I don't believe I've done that. I believe I've given every one of them an opportunity to grow and develop a new idea. I don't believe in original sin. I don't believe that we are fallen people. I believe that we are not yet fully humanized, and that's a very different thing to change.
Yeah, I know that, again, in my religious system, and I'm from the Mormon faith. In my Mormonism, my church, they are declining much slower than most of the other denominations in the world. At the same time, our own leaders have said that 73% of our youth today are inactive by the age of 21. That's what the studies show. And so, as you point out, if we don't do something, this thing is slowly dying, or in some places quickly dying, no matter what.
Yeah, it's just dying a lot faster than most of us in the church seem to think. The Roman Catholic Church is having an equal problem. The conflict going on at this moment in the Roman Catholic Church between the liberalizers and the old traditionalists is about homosexuality. Well, homosexuality is not an issue anymore. We now know that nobody chooses their sexuality. People awaken to their sexuality. Homosexuality is not abnormal. It's simply a part of the spectrum of human sexual response. And when that's the battle, no matter who wins that battle, the church is going to lose. And I think it will. The Roman Catholic Church is the sex crisis, the abuse crisis, and I hate to use homosexual, because I don't think that homosexuals abuse children. But I think that when you begin to deny sex, you begin to have strange manifestations of sexuality all over the place. And you've got them going in every continent of the world, and the Roman Catholics are facing this problem. That means it's systemic. It doesn't mean that it's one or two bad apples. It means it's a systemic problem for the Roman Catholic Church. And I hate to see them in this trouble. The Cardinal Archbishop of Washington, Ted McCarrick, was the Bishop of Newark when I was the bishop there. And I know him fairly well. And I suspected he was involved in things that he has turned out to be quite involved in. But that's, I'm not here to cast blame. I'm here to say you can't hide from the world forever.
Yeah, very true. My listeners are curious because when these faith crises happen, when these fractures happen, often you feel very alone within your own congregation. Your own family sometimes will distance themselves from you. I'm just curious, maybe your thoughts on, as you talk to people who are still in orthodoxy or in a very literal perspective. And again, I come from a church that very much has truth claims that it holds to, and that makes things even tougher. Maybe what things do you avoid or do, Bishop Spong, in terms of when you have these conversations with those who are more orthodox? What are the right things to say? What are the things to avoid saying so as to make a space for the conversation but not get yourself distanced from those you love?
Well, that's a real trouble. That's a real trouble. But the Mormons have some terrific people, like Mitt Romney, for example, who doesn't abide by that fundamentalistic thing. He's still an active Mormon, and whether his children are going to be, I don't know. But that's another issue. But every church has those people. I think you love them. I don't think you try to create a situation. I simply will not say what I don't believe. And people ask me specifically if I believe in the virgin birth. No, I don't. I believe the virgin birth is an early Christian myth. It's not even an original myth. Paul didn't believe in the virgin birth. Mark didn't believe in the virgin birth. The virgin birth makes its appearance in the Christian scriptures in Matthew, which is about a 9th decade book. And then it disappears by the time you get to John. Why can't you look at that and see that myths are important? I think the myth of the virgin birth had something to teach us, but not as a literal thing. They didn't understand that women had an egg cell. They didn't understand that until the first quarter of the 18th century. And when they developed when science developed the theory of the egg cell, then that meant that Mary, the mother of Jesus, passed on her human qualities to Jesus. That means the original sin, which was received from Adam, got passed on to Jesus. Well, what did the Roman Church do? A century later, they passed a doctrine that said Mary was immaculately conceived, so that she was conceived without spot of sin, so that Jesus doesn't wind up being like everybody else. Now, that's a very ingenious sort of thing, but that's not going to save the church from the fact that it's made some serious mistakes throughout history.
Yeah. I want to get some of your own personal journey. So you talked about in your introduction and knowing you a little bit from reading your books and knowing a little bit of your story, you grew up in a religious environment that had some dogma, had some rigidity, imposed some literal belief on you. And yet here you've made this shift to being much more inclusive, being much more open to other meanings in the scriptures below the literal level. And I'm just curious, what were the major things along your journey that pushed you out of that rigidity, pushed you out of that exclusiveness, and opened you up to seeing things a different way? And maybe talk a little bit about some of the things that fractured you and opened you up to that space.
Okay. It's a lifetime of change. The earliest recollection I have of my life came when I was about 3 years old, somewhere between 3 and 4. And my father had hired 2 brick masons to come build a brick wall in our sod yard. And he told me that I could help. And that was a thrill for me because I was going to help build a wall. When these brick masons arrived, they were both black men. One was an elderly black man with white hair, and the other was a young helper. These are the two men. In the course of that day, this elderly black man said something to me. I don't remember what it was. And I replied by saying, yes, sir, or no, sir, to him, whichever was appropriate. Because my parents had taught me that I say sir to everybody who's my senior. Well, my father got very upset and picked me up and took me into the house and lectured me sternly and said to me, you do not say sir to a Negro. Well, that was a strange idea to me. I'd done what my parents told me was a good manners. I had not pleased my father by doing that. And there was something that I simply didn't understand. Why is this black man different? And I didn't understand that at all. Well, what does a 3-year-old do with that? Well, I thought my father was wrong. When you get to be 13 or 14, you're sure your father's wrong. But at age 3, to think your father's wrong is a rather revolutionary thing. But I just swallowed it. I just put it in my book of memories and said, I'll understand this someday. When I was in the 5th grade, I'd be about 10 years old, the members of my class were invited to go to another school in Charlotte for a patriotic assembly. World War II had just begun. And I was chosen to be one of the 2 or 3 or 4 students that went. I didn't know what I was doing, just a lark for me because I was getting out of school. We drove over to the school, and my eyes got bigger than saucers. This school was a black school. I didn't know there was such a thing as a black school. They had black teachers, a black principal, and more little black children than I'd ever seen before in my life. And they all were. It's just an eye-opening experience. I kept my eyes open and my mouth shut. We went into that assembly. They seated us with honor up on the stage. We stood up to sing the national anthem, to say the Lord's Prayer. We do that in North Carolina in 1940. I guess it'd be 43, something like that, 42. Saying the Lord's Prayer in school was something you did. It was just part of the life of the culture. And when we said the Lord's Prayer, everybody in that room knew the Lord's Prayer and said it together. And I suddenly became aware that we all were praying to the same God. I wondered why we didn't worship together. It didn't make any sense to me. When I got to be about 18, I was president of the young people of the Diocese of North Carolina, who were, young Christians. We were Episcopalians. And I went to a convention of the church, and I was introduced to a man who said he was the president of the young people of the diocese. Well, I was shocked by that because I thought I'd been elected to that. And he was a black man. His name was Per Eliezer. And I became aware at that point that the Episcopal Church ran 2 parallel youth programs, one for black people, one for white people, and I didn't know about that. I wrote to my bishop and asked him if I could invite the black young people to come to our convention. You can't have a convention of the young people of the Episcopal Church if you don't include all the young people. And my bishop wrote back and said, no, the people of North Carolina are not ready for that. Well, I wondered who that would be, because I was ready for that. That was in 1948, 49. But that was before the thing got developed. Well, finally, my church began to deal with black people in reality. We had Martin Luther King Jr., who was a great black man. We had Jesse Jackson, who was a black politician. We finally, in my church, we have a presiding bishop today named Michael Curry, who is an African American. And the church has changed dramatically in that sense. Every church I know has black members, including my church here in Richmond. This is the capital of the old Confederacy, but there are a number of black members of the church I attend here in my retirement. And it's just a thrilling thing to see. That all happened in a period of one lifetime. Now, I went through similar revolutions with the doctrine of women and with homosexuals. First, I was as homophobic as anybody I know. When I first knew, I didn't know there was such a thing as a homosexual until I was about 16. And when I heard the word and I heard what it was, I heard the church's response. It was an unnatural response that, these were at best, these were sick people, and at worst, these were perverted people. And that's the way I stood. But then I began to meet gay people. They were neither sick nor perverted. And my life kept expanding in tremendous directions. I've just come home from leading a conference at a place called Chautauqua, New York. And Gene Robinson, the gay bishop of the Episcopal Church, was present in that conference as a leader. And he's a tremendous person. He's not finished his career, but he's made a difference, an indelible difference. There'll never be again a situation where he's not allowed to be a bishop. And we've had several gay bishops since Gene, and that's again a thing that's just changing. Well, those changes make a great deal of sense to me, and the church is stronger when they are there. I love to see the pattern of leadership changing and developing, and it's very thrilling to me. But you can't have it change in every way and not go back to those ancient biblical assertions and not recognize that they too have to change because we don't believe them anymore. We don't think that way anymore. We are not fallen sinners. We do not need a savior. If we understood that Jesus was something different from a savior, it'd open a door, a great door. I just finished reading a book by Elaine Pagels. Elaine is a professor at Princeton University, religion department. She's written a book called The Gnostic Gospels, and she's a tremendous person, and she sees in the Christian faith today a deep and powerful kind of truth. And she writes that book. It's a book called Why Religion. It's not even out yet. It's going to be out before Christmas. Why Religion? She makes a case for why we have religion. And she makes a powerful, non-fundamentalistic case. I think that book's going to be a great book for a lot of people to read.
Beautiful. As you've had these fractures in your own life, and as you've chosen to be outspoken and to be an advocate for inclusiveness, an advocate for understanding, for navigating and helping us kind of enter these conversations where we start to talk about these sacred stories not being literal. Can you talk maybe for a moment about the kind of pushback you've gotten? Have you gotten pushback?
Of course.
I know you have, but maybe to the level that's been, and some of the uncomfortableness of how harsh people can be.
Yeah, well, it's very true. I had the House of Bishops vote to disassociate themselves from me and from my diocese in the year 1990, I guess that was, and they thought that was going to be a great victory for them, but they won by 4 votes. In the House of Bishops, it was 78 to 74 with 2 abstentions, and I was one of the 2 abstentions because I didn't know how to vote on whether I wanted to abstain or be with myself or not. But that we've won that battle, though. We won that battle. I stood up and made a 45-minute speech to the House of Bishops after that vote, in which I outlined my view on homosexuality and told about why I had changed my mind and what had happened to me. And 10 or 12 bishops came up to my chair afterwards and said, if I could have heard you speak before I voted, I would have voted the other way. I knew we had a majority of the bishops from that moment on, and that majority held forever, which it's no longer even a close majority. That's a shift and change. And I'm not even controversial in my church anymore, I don't believe. Maybe it's because I'm not retired. Nobody thinks about that. But I don't run into that kind of crazy fundamentalistic hostility anymore, because I've done my homework and I'm on the higher ground than they are, and they don't want to take me on. But there's plenty of it there. But that church is dying. That old church with those fundamentalistic beliefs, that's dying. As you say, not as fast, because you're always going to keep some people feeling happy if you can just assure them that you have the truth. But it's not going to last forever. It's just not going to last forever. And the Christian church is going to have to change dramatically. And it's going to get smaller. It's not going to get bigger. We're not going to be a success story. But I believe we can make a real difference in the life of our society. And I think we'll do that.
Were you ever tempted to walk away from your church, one, but maybe from Christianity in general? Or had you always just felt like there was something deeper here, and you've maybe had I don't want to say an easy time, because I don't think that's the right way to say it, but you were always inclined to stay and to work these things out? I
think I've always been a deeply religious person, and I don't understand quite why. My mother was a fundamentalist Presbyterian. My father was a non-attending Episcopalian. He died when I was 12 years old. My father my father had a very interesting relationship with the church. It was sort of not a relationship at all. But as soon as he died, the people from my church came to me and said, "Oh, isn't it wonderful? Your father's now with God." And I thought, well, that's interesting, because you told me the things I've learned in your church is my father was anything but with God when he was alive, but he gets to be with God when he dies. And that didn't make any sense to me. Then I was raised as one who would bargain with God. You know, that was the level of my intelligence at that point. At age 12, I was so scared of not having a father that I didn't want to admit that even. And I would bargain with God. God would help me out if I'd do certain things for God. And that lasted till about 15. And then 15, I began to be raised in the issues of my world, like evolution and Copernicus and Einstein and Freud, Sigmund, Isaac Newton, all these great heroes. And they constantly made me think about the Christian faith again. And I came to a different understanding of Christianity. I will never leave Christianity. I'm in church every Sunday. I really love going to church, and I don't always agree with everything they said, but I think in the mainstream that the church is making progress. I went to church recently, and the woman who was the preacher in this service, she went back and referred to the great battle about homosexuals that we fought in the church when Gene Robinson was confirmed. I think that was about 2003. And she said, I was at that convention, and I saw the two sides with, they had spokesmen that spoke every other time, pro and con, pro and con. And I looked at that group, and the people that were con were con about everything. The people that were pro about everything. And I suddenly decided which one of those groups would Jesus be a member of, and it was clear to me he wouldn't be on the con group. And that's 15 years after Gene Robinson. And this woman said, that's when I made my decision. Well, right now, you couldn't vote homosexuals out of the church today. You couldn't the Supreme Court has given equality of marriage to all people. You can get married in Mississippi if you're a homosexual. And the world is living with those realities, and it's getting every year that goes by is another year that an inclusiveness about that position comes into being. Now, people say, well, don't you think homosexuals can sin? Yes, they can sin. So everybody can sin. That doesn't make any difference. And there are no such thing as perfect homosexuals. There are no such thing as perfect heterosexuals either. And most of the terrible things about sex are the games of heterosexual people anyway. Most child abuse is done by heterosexuals. Divorce is a heterosexual thing. Child abuse and spousal abuse is mostly a heterosexual thing. We've got a lot of work to do in the area of sex, but you're not going to do it by starting out by saying sex is evil and that only heterosex is good and homosex is not. That means you don't know many people, that you have had to form that kind of definition that affirms your prejudice. That's not going to work.
Right. Yeah. I again, the religious system I come from had a very racist past, and had they held on to those racist doctrines and policies and that culture, our church today would be completely irrelevant.
That's right.
If not completely decimated. And the very same thing is happening right now in my religious system with the LGBT issues. The church is wrestling with having to let go of some of the things it said in the past, but still trying to maintain this dividing line. And so in our religion, in Mormonism, homosexuals still are not welcomed into full activity unless they remain celibate their entire lives. Yep. And you're seeing that take a toll on the church. So I'm glad to hear you kind of speak of these things in terms of generalities within Christianity, that these things just cannot persist.
They can.
We've made a battle out of saying who's us and who's them, and anybody who isn't us is the bad guy, and we find ways to vilify them. And I think you're seeing the younger generation no longer will tolerate that.
That's right. The Roman Catholic Church its attitude toward women, it's going to look in another 5 years or so. It's going to look like slavery. That is not going to hold. The Roman Catholic Church will ordain women to the priesthood and to the bishopric, but they wouldn't dare admit it. But Francis is laying the groundwork right now for that to happen.
Yeah. Again, when problems stand in front of us, and those problems are going to keep us as institutions from being continually growing or even moving along or perpetuating, suddenly solutions come into sight and are utilized. I want to get your opinion, and you're welcome to speak about Mormonism specifically. You're welcome to speak about maybe high demand fundamentalist religions generally. But I want to start this question off with a quote of yours. You wrote once, you said, "My experience is that whenever a person, a church, a denomination, or a religion claims to possess the truth and thus be the only valid pathway to God, that person, that church, that denomination, and that religion turns demonic. There is an incredible arrogance present when any human being or any religious tradition believes it has cornered the market on the truth of God and can therefore judge anyone who disagrees with them as wrong, inadequate, heretical, or whatever." That's the very culture of the religious system I grew up in, and I agree with you 100%, but I want to get your thoughts on, again, either Mormonism specifically or other religions today that still are high demand fundamentalists, us versus them, we have the truth, everyone else is somehow more lost than us. Maybe your thoughts on that quote in relationship to some of these systems that are still out there.
Yeah, well, they are out there, but they're not going to be very strong. I enjoyed seeing the Book of Mormon in New York when I was a bishop very much, and that play casts a sort of spoof at some of those religious traditions of the Mormons. But in the last analysis, it said that that's okay to have those religions, just don't take them literally. And the play was a rather popular play. It's now playing in Richmond. I think that's kind of interesting. And that play is going to do a lot of things. It's going to infuriate a lot of Muslims, not Mormons, but it's going to those that are already broken from the Mormon Church. It's going to open their eyes to see things in a new way. What makes anybody think that my mind can embrace the truth of God? I'm a little tiny symbol. My mind is capable of embracing a little bit of reality. I haven't got any idea what ultimate reality is. I can't embrace the fact that I live in a universe of more stars in the heaven than there is sand on the beaches of the world. I can't embrace the fact that we live at such huge distances. That my universe is a tiny little universe in a galaxy called the Milky Way, and the next galaxy is millions and millions of miles away, and there are probably 4 billion galaxies in the visible world. How do you embrace that reality? How can you do that when you're sure that God is a man who lives above the sky, who comes down periodically and invades the world? Those things just don't go together. And I think you've got to be living in a world that allows you to dream and to raise stories and tell myths that help you understand what you do not understand. And that's part of the religious function. And I don't believe there's a possibility that the religion of yesterday will continue to be the religion of tomorrow.
Yeah, as you're saying that, I'm thinking again as I go back into my own religious upbringing. I'm a convert to Mormonism at 17 years old, and I served as a lay clergy when I was in my late 20s. And one of the things that Mormonism does is it says not only was there Moses, Noah, and Abraham, and these guys had access to God magic, and these guys could perform incredible miracles like parting seas and calling down fires from heaven. Not only that, but in the present moment, we claim there's somebody on earth who has those exact same powers. And as you're pointing out, there's an incongruity because people who are living in an age of information, in an age when you can type in a few letters on a keyboard, hit enter, and have information on almost anything.
That's right.
The members of my religious system are looking around and they're seeing our top leaders, and they're consciously or unconsciously seeing that these men don't have the same powers that Moses, Noah, and Abraham have, which is forcing, I think, my religion specifically, but I think Christianity in general, to recognize, like, wait a minute, in an age of verifiable, recordable history, things don't seem to happen the way we're told they happen. Again, that wrestle is causing a lot of heartache to people as they have to deconstruct their religious faith. Do you have any thoughts or suggestions for people who are just in the early stages of what I think is best described as crisis, although you and I both know it eventually you look back and you say that was incredible growth. Do you have any suggestions for people as they're deconstructing their religious system to help that be smoother or to feel less alone in that?
I'm not sure you can. You see, I don't think Moses had that power either. The Moses story, if we take it literally, Moses is about 1250 BC. The stories of Moses weren't written until the 10th decade, some 300 years later. There's a lot of time for stories to grow between the time they supposedly happened and the time that they get written down. And it's easy to ascribe heroic tales to great figures. If Moses split the Red Sea, he went about 400 miles out of his way on the journey to the Holy Land. And there's just no way that can happen. The Red Sea is about 70 miles long, and it's not even a good story. As the story says that God put the Red Sea back together again so it would drown all the Egyptians. That's not a very, very pleasant view of God if you happen to be an Egyptian. So I don't know why people take seriously stuff that is before history, where we know that there's a wild imagination. I think you can. I took in my last book, called Unbelievable. I took the miracles of Jesus. I went through them one by one by one by one, and there are all sorts of new ideas that can be gained from the way the book happened. Did Jesus split the bread and wine or the loaves and fishes to feed enough people to feed 5,000 people on the Jewish side of the lake and 4,000 people on the Gentile side of the lake? Not very likely. But that's a story that was told in Christian history. But remember, Jesus died in 33 or thereabouts, and the first gospel was not written until about 73. That means for 40 years there was no gospel written down, and when it was written down, it was enhanced. We look at the story of Jesus' resurrection. Most people are not aware that Mark, the first gospel, never has a story of Jesus' resurrection occur in it. It's just not there. He says he has a messenger who reveals to the women that he is not in the grave and that they will see him when they return to their home in Galilee, but he never appears in Mark's gospel. And that's a story that people ought to take seriously. If you look at John's gospel, Mary Magdalene is the only one that ever sees the risen Jesus. Everybody else, well, that's not quite right. Mary's the only one that sees the ascended Jesus, a raised but undescended Jesus, and she doesn't recognize him. And John, the beloved disciple, comes in the next story, and he sees the empty tomb, and he believes without ever seeing a body. And it's finally they bring the body into the room with the disciples, and Thomas, the other disciples already believed. Thomas finally believes because he's been able to see. And Jesus says, Thomas, you believe because you have seen, but blessed are those who do not see and still believe. That opens the Christian story to a brand new definition. And those stories are just so wonderful if you get into them and go deep enough, and they become powerful again.
And you say as people deconstruct those stories and as they enter the anguish of no longer fitting cleanly in their religious system, you say there's not really a recipe to soften that. And I wonder maybe even if you would argue that you wouldn't want to do that anyway, like the wrestle's important, that going through that stage of anguish is important to the growth that lays on the other side.
I think that's exactly right. What Elaine Pagels does in this book that I mentioned earlier, called Why Religion, she talks about her personal life. It's a tragic life. She lost a 5-year-old son, and she lost her 40-something-year-old husband in a mountain climbing accident within the same year. And she lived through that grief experience, and she finally came to the point where she could look back and see how the Christian faith had met her in that experience. It is not the way people think it is.
Yeah. Again, one more question, I guess, specifically into Mormonism. I'm just curious, in your life spent of learning and investigating different topics and trying to always be a truth seeker and gather information from different avenues within the world, do you have any thoughts? My listeners are just curious if you've had a chance to kind of encounter the Book of Mormon or to think about Mormon theology, even though we're kind of this small minority segment of the world. I do, even as one who has distanced themselves quite a bit from my religious system, I still find Mormonism interesting. And within a short religious history, right? Mormonism's only been around 200 years or less. Within that 200 years, there's a lot of depth there in the history, as well as multiple sacred texts. Just curious if you've ever had a chance during the course of your life to spend a few moments within Mormonism's sacred text or its theology, and what your thoughts were with that.
Well, I haven't lived in parts of the country where it was a major factor, but let me tell you that that it doesn't matter where you begin. If you go deep enough, you come to a beautiful understanding of Christianity. But it may not be anything like what your previous history looked like. That's true with me from Southern Christian fundamentalism. To me, it carried me through the death of my father, but it couldn't carry me through my adolescence, and I had to give it up in order to keep something there that was real. And my life has been growing ever since. And I don't think it's helpful to say anything negative about religion. I think the problem with religion is that people don't go deeply enough in their own tradition. So I would say take the Book of Mormon. I own the Book of Mormon. Take the Book of Mormon and go as deep as you want to in it. And when you come out on the other side, you're going to look and see Mormonism in a very different way from where you saw it before you started. And eventually the world is moving toward some sort of religious sense that I think is going to be bigger than any of us can imagine. I don't think it'd be Protestant. I don't think it'd be Catholic. I don't think it'd be Mormon. It'd probably be an eclectic thing from people who've taken the time to stay the course, to make sure they understood what religion really does and what religion really means. I'm hopelessly religious, I think, and I just love it.
Yeah, I feel that way too. I've got kind of another question or two here, and then I want to end talking for a moment about tearing down the literalness of the historical Jesus and finding meaning still there. But I want to start with a question here about ritual and myth. You and I both realize that discussing the literalness of these stories is the least useful way to dive into these things. Like, let's just set that off to the side. But I am assuming you still realize the importance of ritual and myth and what power those things have to give us meaning in life and to give us stories in order to wrestle with our own morality and to develop, to just be a human being who moves out of binary thinking and begins to see nuance, one who looks to outer authorities and works into a life of finding authority within themselves. I know you find value in that, but the problem is whenever myth stories are created by any religious system, it seems like the majority of the adherents to that religion feel a need and impose on others a need to take those stories literally. In other words, myths are important, and for those who have moved beyond the literal, we see how incredibly inspiring it is to continue to stay in those stories and think about them in new ways. At the same time, there's always going to be the majority of people, at least in our present day, who feel a need to impose those stories as literal, how do we find value in the myth without allowing us collectively to impose those stories in ways that only are used as weapons on others?
Yeah, I find your question interesting because you know they're myths when you create them, and then you must know there's something wrong when you literalize them, because a myth that's literalized is not a myth anymore. I think we just have to take the fact that we are human beings with human brains. Whatever made us think that our human brains could embrace the reality of the universe? I look at the world of animals. A bug doesn't recognize what a bird is, but he lives in a strange relationship with the bird, and he usually gets devoured by the bird. But how can a bug tell you what a bird is? How can a horse tell you what a man is? How can a man tell you what God is? I don't think it's possible. I think you have to have a myth, and then you have to know that your myth is going to unravel, because all myths unravel. None of myths are ultimately true. But they lead you past the crisis in your thinking, and you begin to see the whole world as mythological. I don't know about what the realities of life are, but I know how I trust. I trust life. I trust life after death. I believe that we human beings can penetrate the time boundaries, and we can escape time, and we can have some experiences that are really rather real and precious. But you don't literalize any of it. You just give thanks for it, and you keep growing and changing. The God I worship calls me to be all that I can be. He calls me to live fully. He calls me to love wastefully. He calls me to be all that I can be. And I've got to, that's a lifetime job for me, and I got to continue to roll through those processes in my life. And I'm never going to be secure in my religion, but you don't have to be secure. God is the only one that's secure in this world. You've got to be a seeker and a searcher, and you're going to find the reality of the myth eventually. But it's going to be in the world of myth is never truth. A myth is a way of seeing truth that will finally disappear as truth becomes more and more apparent.
Jack, as I've got a good group of friends here in southern Utah where I live, and all of us as a group, we've deconstructed Christianity in general. We've deconstructed our specific religious system, Mormonism. And yet we still find ourselves wrestling with spirituality. We still find ourselves wrestling with the Christ of faith. We still find ourselves wrestling with what lies out there in the cosmos. And I'm curious, just again, I know you're only sharing your opinion, and your opinion's one opinion among billions of others. But I am curious, as you've wrestled with this over the course of your life, what you think. Like, do you think your consciousness extends beyond death, or do you even not even want to, do you want to stop shy of even answering that question?
Well, I don't mind answering it, but I would say that anytime you talk about that, you're speaking about something you don't ultimately know. I trust that. My consciousness, I live in a world where, I don't know how to say it, but I live in a world where it's always bigger than I am. And when I had a stroke, and it was a powerful experience for me, I simply fell over on the floor. And as far as I was concerned, I was unconscious. But I wasn't unconscious because I was sort of floating around in the room, and I would watch people working on my body. And they started cutting off my shirt. I was wearing a clerical shirt. And they started cutting it off so they could put sensors on my chest. And I urged them not to cut my shirt off. That was part of my identity. And they didn't hear me because they didn't see me or hear me. But anyway, they cut the shirt off and gave it to my wife and rushed me to the hospital and did all sorts of things. And the next day when I woke up, I couldn't move my right arm. I couldn't move my right leg. But I had this clear memory that I'd fainted or gone down and that they had cut my shirt off. I knew that, and they had given it to my wife, and she told me that they had cut it off and given it to her. And I said, I know that. And she said, how do you know that? And she said, well, I saw it. Well, how can you see it if you're unconscious? Well, I don't know how that works. I just know that this consciousness is something bigger than I am. And I believe in life after death. I think Carl Jung, when he raised the possibility of the collective unconscious, raised the possibility that we can participate in life after death in this life by participating in the collective unconscious. I become part of that collective unconscious. I think it's interesting that human beings are the only animal that can be hypnotized. Somebody can have power over our lives. They can't be physical. And I think that's fascinating. So I don't know. I'm 87 years old. I'm probably going to die long before you will. And somehow it doesn't scare me at all, because I'm ready to sort of meet whatever comes next. And I'm perfectly confident to do that. And I live with the triumphant faith that it's going to be real. I can't tell you any more about it than that.
Beautiful, beautiful.
I wrote a book called Eternal Life, Beyond Religion, Beyond Heaven and Hell, Beyond Theism, I think is the title, in which I spent about 250 pages wrestling with this question of life after death. And yes, I came to the conclusion that I believe there's something there, but I cannot tell you what it is.
I really appreciate that answer. I want to end, Jack, talking about just one last idea, which is Jesus himself. And I'll frame it from some of the tension that I live in with this question, and then give you a chance to speak on it. So as I've deconstructed the historical Jesus, I still find incredible meaning. I still find myself every day thinking about the Christ of the New Testament and thinking about the way in which that character interacted with the world and the things that we can learn from that. And I find those things profound. Yet I live in a religious system that is always trying to measure me by whether I believe in these things literally or not. There's great importance within Mormonism, whether you're in or whether you're on the edges or the margins or whether you're out. It becomes easy to discount you if you don't believe in Jesus literally. And while I don't, while I don't hold that as like a definitive idea in my head, and I'm always wrestling with Jesus, the personage of the New Testament, rather than worrying about whether he actually rose on the third day or not, I find that he's an important part of my life, in spite of the fact that my system looks at me and says, like, that's unacceptable, that can't be real, you can't access the atonement that way. I'm just curious, because you've grown up in a completely different religion. You've served as a bishop in that faith. You've been outspoken about this shift that you've had and that you see the world having. I'm just curious if maybe you could share with my listeners who have been on the same journey, if you can share with them how important Christ is to you, even if he didn't rise on the third day, if that makes sense.
Well, he is important to me. And the third day is an interesting symbol. It's part of the Christian faith. The church doesn't agree on the third day. If you read the Bible carefully, there's no day, and he rises from the dead on the third day, but he doesn't appear to anybody in the early part of that narrative. But Jesus is to me a symbol of what human beings can become. He's a bigger symbol than I can imagine. I don't know how to say he's God, because I don't know how God would be made known in a human life, but he's as close to God as I know how to come. He lives fully. He loves wastefully. He dares to be all that he can be, and that's terribly, terribly appealing to me. I don't take the New Testament literally, because the life of Jesus is told in the Gospels, was written between 73 and 100. Jesus died in 33. He died some 40 years before the first Gospel was written. How did they capture him perfectly? No, they capture multiplicities of things about him, and they offer these multiplicities, and the church is the one that's tied these multiplicities down and tried to make it one thing. The church atonement. What does atonement mean? I don't think that word has any meaning at all in our generation. But we still use the word, and we've got to get over using that word because I think it's a dead end street. It leads us nowhere. But the man Jesus, I'd say that when I contemplate this Jesus and the power in this man, he is really overwhelming. He dies without helping. Let me say it this way: he dies without being worried about dying. He lives without being worried about living. He is who he is, whether he's living or dying. They tried to make him the king on Palm Sunday, and he did not change his way at all. They tried to kill him on Good Friday, and it did not change his way of living at all. He was clearly who he was, and that's appealing to me, and that's part of what God means to me. So Jesus is my window into God. And when you get to the place where you begin to say, well, was he God? No, I don't think that makes any sense at all. He's my window into God. He's the same as God. He's what God is, but I don't go beyond that. And to me, that's as far as you need to go to be a Christian.
Beautiful, beautiful. That rings so true to kind of where I'm at, and I think it's going to ring true to a lot of where the listeners are at. I simply want to finish just saying thank you to you, Bishop John Shelby Spong, who we're talking with today. I just want to kind of wrap up saying an appreciation to you. As I've deconstructed my faith, I've looked out into the world for voices, whether it be you, whether it be people like Richard Rohr, whether it be, there's a younger gentleman by the name of Rob Bell. There's different podcasts out there that present a much more inclusive liberal Christianity, such as the Liturgist podcast. There's a lot of voices out there. You're one of them. As I've listened to all those voices, you all come from different perspectives. You all come from different angles. You all have different experiences. But there's some truth that seems unsayable, seems unspeakable, that each of those voices, including you, are walking around the edges of that truth. And it feels like one of the realest things I've ever been a part of in my life is to wrestle with the things that you guys talk about. I just want to say to you personally, thank you for your life's work. What you have represented, what you have called us to, what you have encouraged us to lean into has meant so much to me and is going to mean so much and has meant so much to my listeners. I just want to say thank you for being on today and for your life's work.
Thank you, Bill. One thing more I would say. A long time ago, a man wrote a book called Your God is Too Small. I think that book is where most people are today. The God anybody worships, whether it's in the Roman Catholic Church or the Protestant Church, the Evangelical Church, or the Mormon Church, your God is simply too small. You got to raise your sights to see the embrace of the holy all over the world. And when you do that, you realize that there's a place for everybody.
Amen. Amen, Bishop Spong. Thank you so much for being on today, and
thank you, Bill.
Appreciate your